The year was 1865. The Civil War was ending. Cannons were quiet now, and soldiers were going home. But for millions of people, freedom had just begun. Isaiah Johnson, a young black soldier, stood in his worn-out Union uniform. He had fought bravely, carrying a rifle through mud, hunger, and fire. For him, the war was not only about saving the Union. It was about something greater: freedom for his family, and a chance to build a new life. Isaiah had heard the promise. Every freed family would get land, 40 acres and a mule. To Isaiah, that promise was more than words. It was hope. It meant he could farm his own soil, raise his children with dignity, and finally own something that no one could take away. At night, he dreamed of walking across wide fields, the sun shining over rows of cotton and corn that belonged to him, not to a master. But dreams are fragile. And in America, promises made to black people were often promises broken. The taste of freedom. Isaiah returned to Georgia, where the soil was rich and the fields stretched endlessly. He wasn't alone. Thousands of freedmen and women waited, believing the government would deliver on its word. They had fought, they had bled, and now, they waited for justice. One day, an officer rode into town with papers. He told the freedmen to line up. Isaiah's heart pounded as he stood with the others. The officer read the orders. The land, once taken from Confederate owners, would be given to freed families. Isaiah's hands shook. It was real. For the first time, he felt the ground beneath his feet might truly be his. He imagined building a cabin, planting seeds, and calling it home. He imagined passing it on to his children, and their children after them. For a moment, the weight of change seemed to vanish. The cruel return. But months later, the promise began to crack. President Andrew Johnson, no relation to Isaiah, took power after Lincoln's death. He had no love for freedmen. To him, land belonged to the old masters, not the people who worked it for generations. Soldiers arrived. They ordered freed families to leave the land. The plantations were returned to Confederate owners, the very men who had once enslaved Isaiah's people. Isaiah stood in shock as white landowners returned, riding horses across the fields that had nearly been his. "Get off my land," they said. "My land," Isaiah whispered to himself. His hands clenched with anger. But he had no power. No paper. No protection. The dream of land vanished like smoke in the wind. The first dead. Isaiah took his family to a small cabin on the edge of town. He found work again in the same fields he once hoped to own. This time, he was not a slave, but he was not free either. He became a sharecropper, forced to give most of his harvest to the landowner. His wife, Sarah, tried to stay strong. "We are free," she told him. "Our children will live better than us." But Isaiah knew the truth. Without land, without wealth, freedom was fragile. It was a bird with broken wings. At night, he sat by the fire, thinking of the promise. The government had taken something from him before it was ever fully his. Not just land. Not just a mule. They had stolen the foundation of his family's future. Isaiah whispered to himself, "They owe us. They owe us more than they can ever repay." Whispers of the future. Years passed, and Isaiah's children grew. They worked the same soil he did, but they owned nothing. They had no savings, no land to pass down. The dream of wealth, the dream of independence, was stolen at the very start. Other freed families shared the same story. In church, in the marketplace, in whispers late at night, they all spoke of the promise. 40 acres and a mule. A promise that never came. And deep inside, a question grew stronger: if America had paid its debt then, what would life look like now? The hook for what's next. Isaiah Johnson never saw reparations. He died with rough hands and a heart full of questions. His children inherited his courage, but not his land. His grandchildren would grow up hearing rumors, whispers, and lies about why black families had less, never knowing the truth of what was stolen. The debt was never paid. The promise was broken. And that broken promise would echo through generations, shaping the story of the Johnson family for the next 150 years. But this was only the beginning. Because what Isaiah lost in 1865 was not just land. It was the start of a debt America has carried ever since, a debt still unpaid. Isaiah Johnson's dream of land never came true. But he held on to hope that one day his children might find a way to own something of their own. By the time Isaiah's son, Thomas Johnson, became a man, the Civil War was long over. Slavery was gone, but freedom was still fragile. Thomas carried the same fire his father once had, the dream of building a future on his own soil. And for a short time, it looked like that dream might finally happen. A glimpse of ownership. In 1888, Thomas saved every coin he could. He worked sun up to sundown in the cotton fields, cutting deals when possible, and hiding away pennies in a small jar under his bed. His wife, Mary, sold pies and vegetables to neighbors. Together, after years of sacrifice, they finally had enough to buy a small piece of land. It wasn't much. Just 20 acres on the edge of Georgia, with rough soil and a small creek running through it. But to Thomas, it was everything. "This is ours," he told Mary as they stood on the land for the first time. His voice shook with pride. "No one can take it away." The children laughed and ran through the grass. For the Johnson family, it felt like the beginning of a new chapter. Threats in the night. But owning land as a black family in the South was never simple. At night, Thomas sometimes heard horses outside. White men rode through, torches in their hands, faces hidden under hoods. They didn't speak to him directly, but the message was clear: black people owning land was not welcome. Neighbors whispered warnings. "Be careful, Thomas. They've run families out before. Burned homes. Even worse." Thomas tried to stay strong. "This land is ours," he said. "We paid for it." But deep down, he felt the fear growing. The legal trick. 2 years later, trouble came in another form, not with fire, but with paper. One morning, a man in a suit arrived at Thomas's door. He carried documents with strange words Thomas barely understood. "The bank says you owe more taxes," the man declared. Thomas was confused. "I already paid. I have the receipts." The man smirked. "Not enough. You're late. If you can't pay, the land will be taken." Thomas argued, begged, and showed what little proof he had. But the law was not on his side. The system was built to favor white landowners, and Thomas had no lawyer, no power. Within months, the land he worked so hard to buy was gone. The deed was transferred. A white farmer took control. Back to the fields. Thomas stood with his family as they packed their few belongings. The house they built with their own hands was no longer theirs. The creek, the fields, the soil, all stolen through a system designed to crush them. Mary wept quietly. The children asked questions Thomas could not answer. They moved to a small shack near town, forced to rent land instead of owning it. Once again, they worked for someone else, giving most of their harvest away. Thomas's heart broke every time he walked past his old land and saw another family farming it. His children asked, "Papa, why can't we go back there?" And all he could say was, "Because the law says it's not ours anymore." The pattern. Thomas's story was not unique. All across the South, black families who managed to buy land faced the same cycle. Violence, lies, and legal tricks stole their property. White families grew rich, passing land down through generations. Black families, like the Johnsons, were pushed back into poverty again and again. A new pattern was born, a cycle of loss. Every time a black family climbed one step up, the system pushed them 2 steps back. Isaiah's shadow. At night, Thomas thought about his father, Isaiah. He remembered how Isaiah once whispered by the fire, "They owe us. They owe us more than they can ever repay." Now Thomas understood those words with painful clarity. The debt was growing. It wasn't just the land stolen from Isaiah. It was the land stolen from him too. And one day, it would be the land stolen from his children, if things did not change. The hook for what's next. By 1900, the Johnson family had almost nothing to show for decades of labor. They were free, but without land, without wealth, and without protection. Their freedom was paper thin. Thomas's oldest daughter, Clara Johnson, began to see the truth. She was smart, strong-willed, and tired of watching her family suffer. She promised herself that she would not be silent, no matter the cost. But in the South, a black woman who spoke too loudly faced more than whispers. She faced Jim Crow's iron hand. And soon, Clara Johnson would discover just how heavy that hand could be. By the time Clara Johnson was born, the dream of land ownership had already slipped from her family's hands. Her father, Thomas, still carried the pain of losing his farm. Her mother, Mary, spoke often about the days when the Johnsons had their own soil, their own creek, their own cabin. But to Clara, those stories sounded like legends, tales of something almost magical, something she had never known. Clara was born in the late 1890s, in a South that had written new laws to replace the old chains. Slavery was gone, but a new system had risen to take its place. They called it Jim Crow. A divided world. From the time she could walk, Clara saw the lines that divided the world around her. There were schools for white children, big buildings with clean desks, books, and teachers who had chalkboards filled with lessons. And then there were schools for black children, small, broken shacks with barely enough seats, where children shared tattered books passed down from white schools. There were fountains marked white and others marked colored. Even trains had separate cars. Clara asked her father once, "Papa, why can't we drink from the other fountain? Why can't we sit in the nicer cars?" Thomas sighed. His face was lined with years of disappointment. "Because the law says so, Clara. They say it's separate but equal. But it is never equal." Those words stayed with her. The rules of silence. Jim Crow was not just about laws. It was about fear. Every black person in town knew the unspoken rules: never look a white man in the eye too long, never argue, never speak too boldly. If you did, you risked more than trouble, you risked your life. Clara saw this fear on her father's face when white men rode by their cabin on horseback. She saw it in her mother's trembling hands when they went into town. But Clara was different. She was not afraid of asking questions. She was not afraid of speaking. And that made her dangerous. A spark of rebellion. At age 15, Clara started school in one of those run-down shacks. She loved to read, even if the books were falling apart. She borrowed newspapers whenever she could. One afternoon, she read about a court case in the North. Black men had sued for their rights and won. Clara's eyes lit up. If they can fight there, she whispered to herself, why not here? When the teacher asked the class to write about their future, Clara stood and read her essay aloud. Her voice was clear, strong. "One day, I will live in a world where my children are not judged by color. One day, we will drink from the same fountain, ride the same train, and go to the same schools." The classroom fell silent. Some children stared in awe. Others looked down in fear. The teacher pulled Clara aside after class, whispering sharply, "Child, don't say such things out loud. You could bring trouble on your family." But Clara's fire had already been lit. Trouble in town. Not long after, Clara was in town with her mother. They walked past a bakery when Clara saw a sign, "No coloreds allowed." Her mother tried to pull her along, but Clara stopped. "Why can't we go inside?" Our money spends the same as theirs. A white man standing by the door sneered. Girl, you best keep your mouth shut. Clara's mother gripped her hand tightly. Please, Clara, she whispered. Not here. Not now. But Clara's eyes burned with anger. She wanted to shout, to fight, to demand answers. Only her mother's trembling hands kept her silent that day. Still, Clara knew she would not stay silent forever. The cost of speaking. As Clara grew older, her voice grew louder. She spoke in church, reminding people of the promise of freedom, of the land stolen from her family, of the lies told under the name of Jim Crow. Some admired her courage. Others worried for her safety. One evening, Thomas sat her down. His eyes were tired but filled with love. Clara, he said, I know you want to change things. But the South is not ready to listen. Promise me you'll be careful. Clara looked at her father and shook her head gently. Papa, if we stay silent, they win. If we never speak, nothing will ever change. Thomas said nothing more. He only placed his rough hand on her shoulder, knowing his daughter carried the same fire his father, Isaiah, once had. The hook for what's next. By the early 1900s, Clara Johnson was known in her town as a girl who spoke too boldly, who asked too many questions, who did not bow her head the way others did. And in a world ruled by Jim Crow, that made her a target. Whispers began to spread. Some white townsfolk muttered her name with anger. That Johnson girl talks too much, they said. Her family feared what might come. But Clara did not stop. She could feel something rising, something bigger than herself. A storm was coming. The fight for civil rights was still decades away, but Clara was already standing on the edge of it. And soon, her courage would come face to face with the full weight of Jim Crow's iron hand. By the 1920s, Clara Johnson was a grown woman. She had lived through the harsh years of Jim Crow, through whispers and warnings, through days when speaking too boldly brought danger to her door. She still carried the fire of her father, Thomas, and her grandfather, Isaiah. But fire alone could not build a future. America was changing. Cities were growing, cars filled the streets, factories roared with machines, and money seemed to flow everywhere. But not for everyone. While white families were building wealth, buying homes, starting businesses, and passing money down to their children, black families like the Johnsons were locked out of that promise. Locked doors. Clara worked as a seamstress in Georgia. She sewed dresses for white women who walked proudly through town with lace gloves and shiny shoes. They handed her coins, never enough for the hours she spent. Sometimes she dreamed of opening her own shop. She imagined a place where black women could buy beautiful clothes without being turned away. But when she went to the bank to ask for a loan, the man behind the desk barely looked at her papers. "We don't give loans to your kind," he said flatly. Clara left with her head held high, but her heart heavy. She had the skill, the will, the vision. What she didn't have was access. Red lines. In cities across America, black families faced invisible walls. These walls weren't built from bricks, they were drawn on maps. Banks and real estate agents marked certain neighborhoods with red ink. These red-lined areas were where black families lived. And once an area was marked, no bank would give loans there, no matter how hard a family worked. The Johnsons, like thousands of others, were trapped. They could rent, but not buy. They could work, but not build wealth. Clara once told her younger brother, Samuel, "We are like trees with roots cut short. We can grow, but never tall." The other side of town. Meanwhile, across town, white families were buying homes with government-backed loans. They built businesses with credit from banks. Their children grew up with secure houses, good schools, and money waiting when they became adults. Each generation passed their wealth down, like a gift wrapped in security. But the Johnsons, they passed down struggle. Clara worked, Samuel worked, their children worked, but every coin went to rent, food, and survival. Nothing lasted. Nothing could be passed on. A painful discovery. One summer afternoon, Samuel sat on the porch with Clara. He had just come from working at a factory. Sweat dripped down his face. "Clara," he said slowly, "do you know the Thompson family?" Clara nodded. They were a white family in town, once poor farmers like the Johnsons. Samuel shook his head in disbelief. They bought land after the war. Kept it. Passed it down. Now, they own 3 houses and 2 stores. Their children don't have to work like we do. They already have money waiting for them. He clenched his fists. The only difference between us and them is color. That's it. Papa's land was taken. Their land was kept. And look where we are now. Clara stayed quiet, but his words sank deep into her chest. She realized the truth: this wasn't just about hard work. It was about stolen opportunities. Surviving, not thriving. The Johnsons managed to survive. They worked, prayed, and kept their dignity. But survival came at a cost. Their children could not dream of college, because there was no money. Their homes were rented shacks, because they were denied mortgages. Their savings vanished with every sickness, every storm, every sudden expense. Wealth grew in America, but it grew unevenly, like rain falling on one side of the field while the other side stayed dry. And for the Johnsons, the drought never seemed to end. Clara's fire. Still, Clara did not give up. She spoke in church about justice. She told the young people in her community, "We cannot let them take our hope. They want us to believe we are less. But we are not less. We are equal. And one day, this country must face the debt it owes." Her words gave people strength. But even as she spoke, she knew the truth. Strength was not enough. The wealth divide was growing wider each year. The hook for what's next. By the 1930s, the country faced the Great Depression. Jobs vanished, banks collapsed, and families everywhere suffered. But once again, black families like the Johnsons were hit the hardest. Clara's son, Marcus Johnson, would soon make a choice that would change everything. He would leave the South, chasing the promise of something better. He would join millions of others in what history would later call the Great Migration. But Marcus was about to learn a painful truth: leaving the South did not mean escaping its chains. By the 1930s, America was sinking into the Great Depression. Jobs disappeared, banks collapsed, and families across the country stood in bread lines just to eat. For the Johnsons, who already lived on the edge, the crisis felt like another storm tearing through their fragile lives. Clara Johnson, now older, watched her children grow restless. Her son, Marcus Johnson, could not stop thinking about the stories he heard, stories of opportunity far away, in the North. Chicago, he whispered to his sister one night. Detroit. New York. They say you can find work in the factories there. They say a man can earn a fair wage. His sister frowned. Do you believe that? Do you really think life is different up there? Marcus's eyes burned with determination. It has to be. It can't be worse than here. The journey north. In 1935, Marcus packed his few belongings into a small suitcase. His mother hugged him tightly, tears streaming down her face. Remember who you are, Marcus, Clara said. Remember the land your grandfather lost. Remember the promise your great-grandfather never saw. Don't let the city take your soul. With those words, Marcus boarded a crowded train. He wasn't alone. Millions of black men and women were leaving the South during these years, searching for a new beginning. It was called the Great Migration, and Marcus was part of it. As the train rattled north, Marcus stared out the window. Fields turned into factories, dirt roads turned into city streets. His heart pounded with hope. A new world. Chicago was nothing like Georgia. The city was alive with noise and movement, cars, trains, and people rushing everywhere. Tall buildings stretched into the sky, and smoke from factories filled the air. Marcus found work in a steel mill. The pay was better than anything he had known in the South. For the first time, he had coins in his pocket at the end of the week. He rented a small apartment in a neighborhood filled with other Southern migrants. The streets were crowded, the buildings old, but there was energy, music, laughter, and a sense of possibility. This is it, Marcus told himself. This is the chance our family has been waiting for. New chains. But soon, Marcus learned the truth: the North had its own chains. Landlords charged black families higher rent for smaller, broken-down apartments. White workers often refused to work alongside black workers. And when Marcus tried to move into a better neighborhood, he was met with hostility. One evening, he walked with a friend through a white neighborhood. A group of men blocked the sidewalk. "Go back where you belong," one of them sneered. "This ain't for you." Marcus clenched his fists, but his friend pulled him away. "Don't. They're looking for a fight." It was a bitter reminder. The racism of the South wore a different mask in the North, but it was still there. The riot. In the summer of 1943, tensions boiled over. In Detroit, a race riot exploded, leaving dozens dead. Marcus wasn't in Detroit, but he felt the echoes in Chicago. Black families whispered in fear, white newspapers blamed the victims, and soldiers patrolled the streets. At work, Marcus overheard white co-workers muttering, "These people come here, take our jobs, then cry for more." Marcus felt rage build inside him. He thought of his grandfather Isaiah, of the stolen land, of his father Thomas losing everything, of his mother Clara's endless fight. And now, here he was still treated as less, no matter how hard he worked. Holding on to hope. But Marcus was not a man who gave up. He joined a church that became a center of community strength. He met other migrants who shared their struggles and their dreams. Together, they built something new, a culture of resilience, filled with jazz, gospel, and the hope of a better tomorrow. At night, Marcus wrote letters to his mother. "Life is not easy here," he confessed. "But at least I can dream. At least I can work without a whip on my back. Maybe my children will see the world we have all been waiting for." Clara read his words by lamplight, her hands trembling. She prayed that her son's hope would not be crushed the way her father's and grandfather's had been. The hook for what's next. Marcus Johnson survived the Great Migration. He built a life in the North, raised a family, and held on to his hope. But even in the city, the wealth divide grew wider. White families continued to pass down houses, businesses, and money, while black families like the Johnsons remained locked in rented apartments, always one step behind. Marcus's daughter, Angela Johnson, grew up hearing his stories. She grew up watching her father fight for dignity in a world that refused to see his worth. And when the civil rights movement began to rise, Angela would not stay silent. She would march, she would fight, and she would risk everything for freedom. The Johnson family's fire was not gone. It was only waiting for its next spark.